Namaste everyone, I am your co-host Shravani ma'am. Welcome to your favorite learning channel. The topic for today's video is characteristics of permanent tissue. So in our previous video, we had discussed about the characteristics of meristematic tissue. There we learned different ways of classifying meristematic tissues. We also studied the characteristics of each of them and the functions of meristematic tissues. So in this video, we would be focusing on the characteristics of permanent tissue. We would see a general overview of the two types of permanent tissues, that is the simple permanent tissues and the complex permanent tissues, and the details about them will be taken care of in our next segments of the video. So let's start with the characteristics of permanent tissue. So first, what is a permanent tissue? So what is a permanent tissue? How can we define it? So permanent tissues are the group of cells in which the growth has either stopped, what has happened? Growth has stopped completely, okay? Either the growth has completely stopped or it is stopped for the time being, or is stopped for the time being. So such type of cells in which the growth has either completely stopped or it is stopped for the time being is called the permanent tissue. Okay, so this is the definition of permanent tissue. So what happens? Some cells derived from the meristematic tissue, they lose the ability to divide and they take up specific role. So these cells form permanent tissues. Okay, so the developmental process by which cells derived from the meristematic tissue transform into permanent tissue is called differentiation, which we had learnt in our previous video as well. Now let's look about certain specific characteristics of the permanent tissue. So we can say that the cells of the permanent tissue, they are large. So cells of permanent tissue, how are they? They are large and differentiated. They are large and they are differentiated cells with different shapes, having different shapes, okay, which do not change after formation, and they do not change after their formation. Okay. So the next characteristic feature is that each permanent tissue possesses, so each of the permanent tissue, what do they possess? Each of the tissue possesses less conspicuous nucleus. Less conspicuous nucleus, whereas in case of meristematic tissues, we had learned that they have a large prominent nucleus. Then the next characteristic is that cells of the permanent tissue, so these cells, that is the cells of permanent tissues, they are not closely arranged, and so there are large intercellular spaces. These cells have what? They have large intercellular spaces. Okay, unlike the meristematic tissues. Okay, so the permanent tissues, they have intercellular spaces. Then the next feature is that the permanent tissues contain large vacuoles. So they contain what? They contain large vacuoles in the center. Okay. And the next characteristic feature is that the cell wall of permanent tissues is thin or thick. So their cell wall is either thin or thick. Okay, so these are some of the important characteristic features of the permanent tissues. Now we had already studied that the permanent tissues, they are of different types. Okay, so there are different types of permanent tissues formed due to differences in their specialization, and these different types are, so different types of permanent tissue. One is the simple permanent tissue, and the next is the complex permanent tissue. Okay, so these are the two different types of permanent tissues. And then let's see a general overview of the simple permanent tissue. We will talk about the simple permanent tissues in detail in our next video. Okay, so first let's talk about simple permanent tissue. Here we will only see a general overview. So the permanent tissues in which the cells are similar in structure, origin and function are called simple permanent tissue. So these are the tissues. These are what? These are a type of permanent tissues in which the cells have similar structure. Okay, so the cells are similar in structure, function and origin. Okay, so such tissues are called simple permanent tissues. Now this simple permanent tissue, the simple permanent tissues are of three types. And what are they? One is the parenchyma, then there is collenchyma, and the third one is sclerenchyma. So these are the three different types of simple permanent tissue, and we will talk about each of them in detail in our next videos. Next type of permanent tissue is the complex permanent tissue. Complex permanent tissue. So what are these? So a tissue that consists of several kinds of cells, but all of them function together as a single unit is called a complex tissue or a complex permanent tissue. Thus we can say that a complex permanent tissue or the complex tissues are made up of, more than one type of cell, They are made up of more than one type of cells, okay, which coordinate to perform a common function, which coordinate to perform a common function. Okay, so such type of cells, that is the tissue, complex permanent tissue, have cells that are more than, that is these tissues are made up of more than one type of cells that coordinate to form a common function. Okay, so such tissue is called the complex permanent tissue. Now the complex permanent tissue, so the complex permanent tissues, they are also of two different types. And what are they? One is the xylem and the next is phloem. So these are two different types of complex permanent tissues. So both are conducting tissues. Both of these tissues, they are what? They are conducting. They are conducting tissues in the plants. Okay, and they constitute what? They constitute vascular system of the plant, or the vascular system, or the vascular bundle, we can call vascular system or vascular bundle. Okay, so vascular or conductive tissue is a distinctive feature of the complex plants which made it possible for their survival in the terrestrial environment. Okay, so the different types of cells found in vascular bundle are xylem elements and phloem elements. Okay, so different types of cells in vascular bundle, different cells present in vascular bundles are called the xylem elements. Okay, the xylem elements and the phloem elements. Okay, so these are the different cells that are present in vascular bundles. We will talk about both xylem and phloem in detail in our next videos. Okay, so now let's quickly revise the things that we have covered today. So today we discussed in detail about the characteristics of the permanent tissue. So first we saw how to define permanent tissue. So a group of cells that are either, okay, so group of cells in which the growth has either stopped completely or the growth is stopped for the time being. Such cells are form the permanent tissue. Okay, now what are the specific characteristics of permanent tissue? So the cells of permanent tissue, they are large and differentiated, having different shapes. Okay, and they do not change after the formation. Then each of the permanent tissue possesses less conspicuous nucleus, and these cells, that is the cells of the permanent tissue, they have large intercellular spaces and they contain large vacuoles in the center, and the cell wall of permanent tissue, they can be either thin or thick. So these are some of the important characteristic features of permanent tissue. Then we saw that permanent tissues can be divided into two types. There are two types of permanent tissues, that is the simple permanent tissue and the other is complex permanent tissue. Then these simple permanent tissue, what are they? They are a type of permanent tissue What happens here? The cells of simple permanent tissues, they are similar in structure, function and origin. These simple permanent tissues, they are again of three different types. One is parenchyma, second is collenchyma, and the next one is sclerenchyma. Then we also talked about the complex permanent tissue. So what happens in complex permanent tissue? It is actually a tissue that consists of several kinds of cells, but all of them function together as a single unit. Okay, so here this tissue is made up of more than one type of cells, and these cells together, they coordinate to perform a common function, and such cells constitute to form the complex permanent tissue. This complex permanent tissue is again of two different types. One is xylem and the other is phloem. And both these tissues, that is xylem and phloem, both of these tissues, they are conducting tissues and they form the vascular system or vascular bundle in plants. And this vascular or conductive tissue is a distinctive feature of the complex plants, which made it possible for their survival in the terrestrial environment. Okay. Now the different cells that are present in these vascular bundles, they include xylem elements and phloem elements. We'll discuss about all of these in detail in our next video. So I hope you all would have got some great insights by watching today's video. Please do not forget to like and share the video. Till then, thank you for watching.